Welcome to the Further Light Podcast, presented by Wisconsin Freemasonry, helping you accomplish your Masonic goals through education and more light. And now, I present to you, Brother Chris Ludke.
Listeners, scholars, brothers, this is Brother Chris Ludke, and today I want to look at this idea of dressed for the occasion. This comes from an article that Worshipful Brother Pat Cholka wrote for the Masonic Journal. Of course, as usual, I want to explore it and kind of annotate it as I go through it, because it's got some interesting ideas, and ideas that come up from time to time. We've all heard these ideas about whether or not there's a proper dress code for a lodge. Of course, every lodge has its own culture. So I want to explore this, but I want to do so through the words of Worshipful Brother Pat Cholka. He writes, quote, "If you have ever read anything I have written," well, Pat has written, "I hope you understand two things about how I think. Understanding why we do things is as important as knowing what to do, and that symbolism pervades nearly every aspect of Masonry, even how we dress. Before I continue, let me explain that I do not intend this article to be a criticism of any lodge or Mason. Many lodges have adopted, formally or informally, customary attire that has become part of their culture. The development of a culture is important for a lodge, and is not my place to criticize that. When I speak of formal Masonic dress, I refer to those stock and customary images that we typically see associated with a Masonic meeting. I speak of the dark suits or tuxedos someone who knows little of Freemasonry typically associates with how its members dress. You can walk into almost any lodge in this jurisdiction and see photographic evidence of this formal attire. This attire has changed some since the formation of the Grand Lodge of England in 1717. Whether the traditional Masonic attire of the time was evening dress, white tie and tails, morning dress, frock or coat tails, tuxedos, or dark suits, formality was the common theme. I've read some papers on the topic over the years, and much of what I have read falls into the category of the author expressing his opinion as to why formal attire is important or often associated with Freemasonry. I will not quote any of those sources here. From that research, I believe there are three reasons why formal attire is important. Perhaps the easiest to explain is tradition. Masonry is rich in tradition, is an important aspect of the craft. Tradition is expressed in many ways. How we dress under our aprons and regalia is certainly an expression of that tradition. While this reasoning does not provide any insight into why it is tradition, I would be remiss if I did not provide it here for your consideration. As far as evidence of this tradition, all you need to do is reference the photographic evidence I mentioned earlier, or conduct a search of Google Images on the internet. For many Freemasons, dressing formally comes as naturally as breathing and is as traditional as the form of opening a lodge. This tradition leads directly into the next reason I will address: respect. The business of Freemasonry is serious business. In that regard, our meetings are no different than an executive business meeting, and our ritual as solemn as any religious service. Just as you would dress to respect those that preside over or attend those functions, and the business conducted therein, Masons dress to respect the business of the craft, the presiding officers, and the brothers in attendance. Certainly, how we dress is not the only way to show respect to the craft and our brothers. Giving them our undivided attention, observing proper Masonic protocol and etiquette are others. How we dress is the most visually evident. When you consider the business of the fraternity at a very high level, improving ourselves, positively impacting our communities, meeting and connecting with our brothers, introducing others to the precepts of Masonry, just to name a few, I think you will agree that this business is certainly deserving of our respect. The final of my three reasons is that how we dress is an expression of equality. The idea that we, as Masons, are equals is expressed in several places throughout our ritual. The most obvious place is certainly the symbolic meaning of the level. It could be said that without the ideas of equality, Masonry would be something different altogether. It has often been said, whatever an individual's circumstance within life, within Freemasonry, we are all equal. Much like the military or athletic uniforms are meant, at least in part, to identify and unite its members, the formal dress of Masons has a similar impact. If you have ever attended an event or function and been either over or underdressed, you may have felt like you stood out, either for the better or the worse from the rest. I believe that, at least in part, the formal customary attire is intended to eliminate just that feeling. Oftentimes, it isn't until you feel like you fit in that you feel like you are accepted, despite how accepting your brothers are and how anxious they are to get to know you. In conclusion, I must reiterate, do not take anything I've written to say that the customary attire of any lodge is improper. That is not the purpose of this article. I only wish to explain why I understand the formal attire that is generally associated with Freemasonry is important. A comment has been made that to attract younger men, lodges need to relax the formal appeal for fear they would turn them away. In my experience, the opposite tends to be true. If you consider that any man interested in Freemasonry, if he did not already know a Mason, more than likely came across photos of Masons in formal attire during their research, if that is the case, then those men were drawn to the fraternity, at least in part because of it. In my opinion, and understanding how we dress is symbolic of these three things: tradition, respect to the craft, and our brothers, and equality. You may agree or disagree with me, and I am sure that there are other reasons that can be added to the list, but I hope this sheds some light on the significance of Masonic formal dress. And he has a point. There's definitely elements of tradition, of ritual, of equality that go into this. When we look at a lodge, you will notice that almost any lodge you visit will have most of the members dressed in a similar way. Now, that may be that they're in polos and jeans, because that is just what they do. Maybe it means that they're in suits. Maybe it means that during meetings, they're dressed all over the place, sort of casual. But during degrees, they're particularly cleaned up. My home lodge of Waukesha had a tradition for a long time of the officers wearing tuxedos to degrees. Now that has backed off a little bit in the last couple of years to suits, to dark suits. But it still serves the purpose. We're dressing in a way that we wouldn't otherwise dress. And this gives us an air of solemnity for the moment. It gives us an air of equality, that these officers are all equal to one another, or all the brothers, if they're all dressed the same, are equal. It shows a respect to the craft, to what we're doing. So there is a reason for it, and this comes up. The reason I'm reading it now is I've recently been hired to a private boarding school in the area with a very long tradition of effectively uniform, well, literally uniform for the students, and then effectively uniform for the faculty. And it has an impact. Brings us together in a lot of ways. Now, I'm not suggesting that we go out and all dress identically. That's far from what Masonry is about. Nor am I suggesting that we all need to buy a tuxedo. What I am suggesting is that we give it some thought. We think about how we present ourselves to candidates, to each other, to the lodge. How do we come off when we're seen afterwards? I couldn't tell you the number of times that we have gone out as a lodge after a degree, after a meeting, primarily after a degree, and people come up to us, "Hey, where have you been? What are you wearing? Were you at a wedding, a funeral? What is it that you're all wearing tuxedos?" as we walk into a local establishment? It draws attention. And this may be something to think about. Again, it's not to say that you can't walk around in polos and jeans. That's perfectly fine. But I would suggest that your lodge consider some kind of dress code, some kind of discussion about it at least. Think about why you dress the way you do, and see if it draws you together. See if it increases the brotherhood, that idea of putting on that uniform, that outfit. Does that say, I'm going to lodge? Do you get excited when you put on that suit or sport coat or whatever the situation is? Does it give you a sense of not only what are you going to do, but also a sense of community? Does it give you a sense of equality? Does it give you a sense of tradition? These are just things to think about. And maybe one brother out of the 7 listeners thinks about this and goes, you know what? Yeah, let's consider this. Let's at least have the conversation in the lodge. And that's what I suggest would be perhaps the most important thing. Simply having the conversation. You could think about what are some other ways we could show respect to Freemasonry, if not dress? You think about what are the traditions of the lodge, and let me say, as one of the somewhat younger members, although I'm getting into my middle age these days, that it's not going to scare people off to say, hey, we'd like you to wear a suit, or we'd like you to at least wear a sport coat. You may not need a tie, but we'd ask you to wear a coat of some form. It may impress the candidate. It may encourage them to see what they're doing as important, as solemn, as being part of something larger than themselves. Just some things to think about. Thank you for joining me, Brother Chris Lickey, and the entire Further Light team on your quest to find more light through Masonry.
Are you interested in learning more about Freemasonry in Wisconsin? Visit wisconsinmasons.org to learn more about Masonry and access further educational content and more light. Once again, that address is wimasons.org. Any questions, comments, or suggestions, please email us at education@wisconsinmasons.org. And thank you for listening.